In order to let air out of the lungs and release CO2 from the body, we need to compress the rib cage. Remember Boyle's law. This time, when you decrease the volume, you increase the pressure. Increased or positive pressure within the lungs will push air out. What you want to remember about exhalation is that we need to compress the thoracic cavity. How do we decrease the volume of the thorax? We will discuss two ways: quiet breathing and forced exhalation. During quiet breathing, muscular effort was required to inhale and to expand the rib cage. Remember that it was the costal cartilage that gave some flexibility to the rib cage. The muscles of inhalation all have to work hard to expand the thorax. However, when these muscles stop contracting, the thorax wants to return to its more relaxed resting state. This natural recoil of the diaphragm muscle and bony rib cage when inhalation muscles relax results in compression of the thorax. As the diaphragm relaxes, it pushes the thorax back up to shorten its length. Concurrently, the bony rib cage relaxes and compresses the lungs as well. This natural recoil requires no muscular effort. Take a moment and take a few deep breaths again. Notice your diaphragm pushing your belly out and your rib cage expanding as you take a deep breath. Now hold your breath for a moment. Not too long now. Release your breath and make no muscular effort. Just let the air flow out of your open mouth. This is the natural recoil effect for quiet exhalation. Now let's say you needed to push more out of your lungs, or you need to quickly move air in and out. If you move beyond quiet breathing, you'll need to begin to recruit additional muscles to force exhalation. Going beyond the natural recoil will require muscular effort to squeeze air out of the lungs and compress the thoracic cavity. You will use a couple thoracic muscles and a few abdominal muscles to accomplish this. This tutorial presents 2 thoracic muscles and 4 abdominal muscles that contribute to forced exhalation. The first muscle of forced exhalation to learn is one you already know, sort of. Remember the internal intercostal muscles? This band of muscle attaches between the ribs on the inner surface of the rib cage. Also remember that it has 2 portions. The interchondral portion was between the costal cartilage in the front and helped with inhalation. Now, the interosseous portion, between the bony parts of the ribs, helps with exhalation. Say it out loud. The interosseous portion of the internal intercostals helps with exhalation. Each muscle fiber begins on the rib above and courses down to the rib below. The action when these muscle fibers contract, just the interosseous portion remember, is to pull each rib downward and inward to compress the thorax during exhalation. The second thoracic muscle of forced exhalation is the transverse thoracis. A transverse muscle generally runs more sideways or horizontally across a structure. Therefore, the transverse thoracis muscle runs across the thorax. This muscle is actually located on the inside of the thoracic cavity, so is best seen on a posterior view of the sternum and rib cage. When these muscle fibers contract, they also have the action to compress or lower the rib cage during inhalation. There are 4 sets of abdominal muscles that create a tube to provide support and compression of the abdominal cavity. Remember that the abdominal cavity is located inferior to the diaphragm. It contains organs like your stomach, liver, and intestines. An aponeurosis is like a tendon. Remember how the diaphragm inserted into its central tendon? Similarly, the abdominal muscles insert onto tendons rather than directly onto bones. In this picture, notice the rectus abdominis muscle, which gives a buff person his or her characteristic six-pack. The rectus, think erect or upright abdominis muscle, is a vertical muscle that connects from the pubic bone below the ribs above. However, rather than being one long continuous muscle, it is made up of smaller muscle fibers that connect at different aponeuroses along the way. Thus, when each segment of the muscle contracts, you get the characteristic six-pack. Contraction of the rectus abdominis muscle results in compression of the thorax by lowering the rib cage. The abdomen is supported posteriorly by the vertebral column and inferiorly by the pelvis, but there are no bones to contain the abdominal structures. This support comes instead from 3 layers of muscles. The innermost, or deepest, of these is the transverse abdominis, followed by the interminal abdominal oblique, and then the external abdominal oblique muscle, located most superficially toward the outer surface of the body. The direct action of all these abdominal muscles is to compress the abdomen. Note that this compression results in the indirect action of raising the diaphragm, since the contents of the abdominal cavity cannot move in any other direction when compressed. Raising of the diaphragm muscle will cause the vertical length of the thorax to shorten, thereby compressing the lungs and causing forced exhalation. In these images, you should be able to recognize that the transverse abdominal muscle runs horizontally from the back to the central aponeurosis in front. The internal abdominal oblique muscle runs from the inside of the hip, pelvic girdle, up and across to the central aponeurosis in front, and the external abdominal oblique runs from the rib cage above, down and across to the central aponeurosis in front of the belly. Contraction of all 3 of these abdominal muscles results in forced exhalation. Here's a little demonstration of forced exhalation. Take a deep breath. No, a really deep breath. Now let the air out slowly and steadily. Keep going, letting more and more air out. When you think you're out of air, keep going. Push out as much air as you can. What happened to your posture as you recruited additional muscles of forced exhalation? Did you notice your shoulders come down, your chest cave inward, and your postural stoop forward onto your belly? If so, you just recruited all of your muscles of forced exhalation. Congratulations! Now be sure to take another breath to refill your lungs.